The pale sun of a harsh Montana autumn barely illuminated the vast expanse of Highway 200. Sofia, an architect in her early 30s, with brown hair tied in a messy bun and reading glasses dangling from her shirt, drove in silence. A project in Missoula awaited her. Suddenly, a vivid, chilling vision struck her like lightning. Her SUV, a black Honda CR-V, colliding head-on with an out-of-control truck on a sharp curve, exploding in flames. The shattering impact, the twisted metal, and finally, the explosion that consumed her in fire. The smell of burning rubber and the sensation of hellish heat filled the car, even though it was all just a macabre projection. She gasped, the steering wheel slipping from her damp hands. The dangerous curve, just a few kilometers ahead, seemed like a portal to hell. The pulsing fear in her temples was almost palpable, hammering a frantic rhythm in her head, echoing the muffled sound of the engine. Sofia gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, skin pulled taut over her joints, and the premonition of the explosion refused to leave, dancing in her peripheral vision like a macabre mirage. Passing a small, rusty sign, almost swallowed by overgrown vegetation and time. Feeling a pang of relief, mixed with a persistent anxiety, almost a premonition that the danger hadn't truly disappeared, merely changed form. Her eyes constantly scanned the rearview mirror, searching for signs of imminent danger, for any shadow that might materialize into her silent, invisible pursuer. Every elongated tree shadow, every bush swaying in the wind, seemed to hide a threat, a silent warning, an invitation to the abyss, to the end. The attempt to escape had begun, but the echo road, silent and relentless, seemed to whisper a sinister warning that her destiny still awaited her, lurking in the shadows, patient and implacable, ready for the final strike at the least expected moment. The sound of tires grinding on the uneven terrain filled the cabin, a harsh noise that echoed the sound of her own teeth clenched in tension, almost painful. The smell of stirred dust and dry autumn leaves invaded her nostrils, mixing with the metallic, acrid aroma of fear, an olfactory cocktail of apprehension. The sun, now almost completely hidden by denser, darker clouds that seemed to weigh on the landscape like a funeral shroud tinged. The vastness with shades of orange and purple, a sunset that looked like an open wound in the sky, bleeding light and hope. The vegetation began to thicken, tall, slender pine trees forming an impenetrable barrier on both sides of the road, transforming the landscape into a dark green, claustrophobic tunnel, a labyrinth of shadows. The sense of isolation was immense, almost palpable, as if she were entering another world, a place where the laws of reality would bend to the will of fate, an unknown and dangerous territory. That read, alternate route, scenic bypass. A desperate idea blossomed in her mind, like a last hope amid overwhelming despair, a ray of light in the darkness. It was a route known to be much longer and winding, cutting through a more isolated and wild stretch of forest, a little-used, forgotten detour. She remembered reading about it on a travel blog, described as a picturesque, yet forgotten and little-traveled path, a route for adventurers and those seeking to avoid main roads. It was a significant detour, adding hours to her journey and perhaps even causing her to miss the important meeting in Missoula, a vital project for her career. But at that moment, anything to avoid that cursed curve seemed like salvation. A battle cry against fate, a desperate attempt to cheat death, a constant, terrifying reminder of her imminent fate. The radio, which had been playing a soft, comforting country melody, now seemed to emit a shrill, incessant static in her ears, drowning out everything else, transforming the SUV's cabin into a sonic torture chamber. A feverish, desperate sense of urgency dominated her, a pressing need to act, to flee the destiny that the premonition had drawn with such cruel and vivid strokes, a race against time. Highway 200 ahead, stretched straight and desolate, a ribbon of gray asphalt that disappeared into the distant, seemingly endless horizon. On one side, vast golden dry fields extended as far as the eye could see. gently swaying in the wind like a parched sea of wheat. And in the distance, the imposing Rocky Mountains outlined the horizon in shades of blue and gray, majestic and indifferent to her torment, watching her. The thin Montana air in late autumn carried a distinct scent of pine and damp earth, an aroma that, paradoxically, seemed to heighten her sense of loneliness and vulnerability, intensifying the drama of her flight. The sky, a pale and menacing gray, with heavy clouds gathering, seemed to conspire with the gloomy atmosphere that enveloped her, promising not a clear dawn, but an eternal, hopeless twilight. Sofia grabbed her cell phone, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it, the device slipping in her sweaty fingers. Dialing the emergency number, her voice failed, a mere hoarse, choked whisper. Accident ... truck ... Highway 200. Sharp curve. She stammered, words tumbling out of her throat, mixed with the sound of her own ragged, gasping breath. The operator, with a calm, professional voice that cruelly contrasted with Sofia's panic, asked for more details, trying to understand the confusion. Sofia tried to describe the premonition, the visceral, unshakable certainty that it would happen. But the incredulity in the operator's voice, though subtle, was evident, almost a silent judgment of her sanity. She promised to send a patrol car to check, but Sofia knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough to change the course of something so predestined. She knew that simply alerting them wasn't enough. She needed to deviate, to forge her own path, to force a change in destiny's script. She signaled sharply, the turn signal clicking dryly and repetitively, and turned right onto the narrow gravel road. "You can't get me," she whispered into the void, to the destiny that seemed to pursue her with relentless ferocity, like a hungry, tireless predator. The scenic bypass was exactly as Sofia remembered from the accounts. A cracked asphalt ribbon, dotted with debris, dry leaves, and small branches, precariously winding between centuries-old trees, imposing pines with gnarled trunks and rough bark, and rock formations that rose like silent sentinels, observing her passage with timeless indifference. The sun had already completely set, plunging the sky into a deep and impenetrable darkness, and the forest's gloom became almost absolute. "You avoided the curve," she repeated to herself, like a desperate mantra, the words sounding hollow in her own ears, trying to calm her heart, which pounded erratically in her chest, a frantic drum in her own skull, about to burst from anxiety. But the voice of reason was muffled by the whispers of the road, which seemed to mock her futile attempt to deceive destiny, and the vegetation became so dense that the car's lights could barely penetrate the tangle of branches and leaves, creating a labyrinth of shadows ahead of her. Visibility was minimal, almost non-existent, and Sofia felt as if she were driving blind, relying only on intuition. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was intense, almost suffocating, mixing with the aroma of humidity and fear. She fumbled in the back seat, grabbing a flashlight, her only guide in the darkness, a faint beam of light amidst the gloom. Her steps were hesitant, almost dragging, as she approached the fork, every fiber of her body screaming for her to turn back, to flee that place as quickly as possible. The path to the right was almost impassable, dry. Sharp branches scratched the air. Loose stones made the terrain treacherous and dangerous, a path to destruction. The other path, though narrow, seemed more passable, but the uncertainty was torturous. Sofia's heart pounded like an uncontrolled drum in her chest, a frantic rhythm of pure dread. Which was the trap? Which path would lead her to death? The uncertainty was a silent torment, a psychological torture that seemed more excruciating than death itself. The uncertainty of which step would be her last, which choice would seal her fate. It was then that she saw it. A rusty stop sign, almost completely swallowed by overgrown vegetation and moss, indicated a fork in the road, a gloomy and mysterious crossroads. To the right, an even more precarious path, marked only by two almost invisible tire tracks, as if no one dared to travel there. A path to oblivion, to the unknown. To the left, what seemed to be the continuation of the scenic bypass, a slightly more defined path, but still doubtful and uncertain, without guarantee. Echoing in her mind like a silent, cruel warning, a promise that it wouldn't be defeated so easily, that there was still a price to pay. And suddenly, this fork seemed to fit ominously into her vision. A new piece in the puzzle of death, a new challenge. If the main road was a danger, perhaps the detour was another, a camouflage trap, more treacherous and subtle than the previous ones. Sofia stopped the car, the engine idling, its rough sound breaking the night silence, a sound that, at that moment, seemed like the heartbeat of death itself, approaching with every second. She grabbed her cell phone, desperately trying to get a signal to check the map, for a last hope of orientation, but the screen remained without service, showing only the no network icon, a sign of total isolation and helplessness. Frustration bubbled up inside her, mixed with a growing sense of helplessness, of being completely at the mercy of larger, unseen forces, punctuated only by the weak flickering beams of her headlights which barely pierced the curtain of shadows creating ghostly shapes ahead. A deer with large, dark eyes reflecting the headlights like black jewels in the darkness stopped abruptly right in front of her, imposing and silent, a materialized forest ghost. Sofia braked sharply, with a muffled scream that died in her throat, and the seatbelt tightened brutally against her body, almost crushing her. The smell of burning rubber instantly filled the cabin, suffocating her, and the air became unbreathable, thick and toxic. For an instant, which seemed like an eternity suspended in time, she imagined the scene of an accident. The car violently flipping, the sound of metal twisting with an agonizing shriek, the ravenous flames consuming her, without mercy, exactly as in the Premonition. The deer, for its part, simply stared at her for a brief moment, its eyes expressing a mix of curiosity and surprise, before leaping nimbly into the forest's darkness, disappearing like a shadow, leaving Sofia, trembling, her heart in her mouth, her body tense and sweat trickling down her forehead and back. The cold outside was intense, biting the air with a chilling cruelty that seemed to penetrate her bones, and the car's heater struggled in vain to keep the cabin minimally comfortable. That had been a trap, a small skirmish with destiny, proof that it wouldn't give up easily, that it would test her at every turn, every step. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands, which still gripped the steering wheel tightly, and continued, her muscles aching from tension, her body feeling like stone, rigid with dread, only softening the sharp sting of the approaching winter, moving with slow but inexorable steps like an inevitable presence. The scent of damp earth, moss, and conifers permeated the car through the ventilation, an aroma that, in other circumstances, could be relaxing and comforting, but which now only heightened the feeling of being lost in a dark, unknown labyrinth, a place where logic seemed to have no place and time became distorted. The silence was oppressive, a heavy blanket that seemed to muffle every sound, broken only by the constant monotonous hum of the engine, which sounded like a hoarse lament, and the occasional dry snap of dead branches under the tires, as if the forest itself were breathing or crawling, accompanying her. Sofia turned on the radio again, desperate for any human sound that could fill the terrifying void, for a voice to bring her back to reality, but nothing. Only static, an irritating and incessant hiss, a constant and cruel reminder that she was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world, at the mercy of what was to come, of what fate held. The premonition, which once seemed a distant memory, now materialized in every shadow passing by the windows, in every indistinct sound the forest produced, in every shiver that ran down her skin, like a cold that came from within, from her very soul. She felt her skin crawl, and a chilling shiver ran down her spine, a premonition of something sinister and inevitable, a growing sense of dread. "It's okay, Sofia. You're safe," Suddenly, her car's lights caught a figure on the side of the road, amidst the shadows. "Almost," she whispered, her voice hoarse and choked with fear, a barely audible thread of sound. The road began to narrow even further, the sides of the track almost grazing the trees. The premonition had been so clear. The sharp curve, the truck, the explosion. She got out of the car, the icy Montana wind embracing her in a cold, biting hug, making her tremble uncontrollably and raising goosebumps on her skin. Sofia stood there, paused at the crossroads, the faint, trembling light of the flashlight cutting through the impenetrable darkness of the Montana forest, creating distorted and eerie shapes on the trees. The wind whistled through the pine trees, a sound that seemed to whisper her name, calling her to an inevitable destiny, almost a ghostly lament. The scent of resin and damp, icy pine needles permeated the air, an aroma that evoked a sense of desolation and isolation, and the feeling of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere was overwhelming, almost suffocating, a void that seemed to swallow her whole. Her eyes scanned the two paths with a feverish, almost desperate intensity, trying to discern which one represented destiny's most dangerous trap, which would lead her to certain death. The path to the left seemed the least risky, the least likely to hide terrible surprises, the most sensible path, though still uncertain. The trees closed in on the car, forming a dark, claustrophobic tunnel, and the headlight's light could barely penetrate the curtain of foliage, blurring her vision into indistinct shapes. The bridge looked old, unstable, and the darkness prevented her from assessing its true condition, the river's depth, the structure's resistance, the safety of its pillars. A strong instinct, almost a voice in her head, warned her not to proceed. Perhaps the trap wasn't the curve on Highway 200, but this precarious bridge, a fatal fall into the dark, icy river, a slow, desperate drowning. Every curve, every ascent, every descent seemed like an approach to a new danger, a new test imposed by destiny, a countdown to something terrible and inevitable. In the rearview mirror, there was nothing but absolute darkness, nothingness, the void from which she tried to escape. Turning around there would be almost impossible. The road was too narrow, trees blocking any maneuver, making her a prisoner of the path. She was trapped between uncertainty and fear, unsure which danger was more imminent, which choice would condemn her to death. The smell of damp wood and mold was strong in the air, mingling with the forest's odor, creating an aroma of decay and putrefaction. The car, for its part, seemed to have gained a life of its own, the engine sounding like a rapidly beating heart, a silent, constant warning of imminent danger. Sofia made an impulsive decision, driven by pure instinct for self-preservation, a cry for life in the silence of death. Ignoring the voice of reason that told her to proceed, she engaged reverse, carefully maneuvering into a small, almost imperceptible recess on the side of the road in the darkness. It took several minutes of slow, precise maneuvers, with branches scratching the car's body, like sharp claws on a wounded animal. But she managed to turn around, sweat trickling down her forehead and soaking her hair, relief mixed with terror. Sofia's heart was in her throat, beating frantically and irregularly, and she felt cold sweat trickling down her back, sticking her shirt to her skin, chilling her completely. The decision to avoid the bridge seemed the most sensible, the safest, a small victory against destiny, a chance to breathe. Destiny, she thought, with its cruel irony, had tried a new trick, and she had avoided it. But the question remained, pounding in her mind with painful insistence, which was the right path? The path to the right, which she had initially dismissed, now seemed a possibility, perhaps the only one left, the last option. Perhaps death was not on Highway 200 or the bridge, but in the very decision to avoid them, in the stubbornness of fighting against what seemed inevitable, a cat-and-mouse game with destiny that seemed endless. She engaged first gear. The car shuddered slightly, and slowly turned the wheel, entering the seemingly less dangerous path. It looked poorly maintained, its wooden planks creaking and swaying with the slightest wind, as if they would give way at any moment, threatening to crumble. The sound of water flowing beneath, a river invisible in the darkness, was ominous, a sinister murmur that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a siren song of death. Sofia slowed down, the car almost stopping, the bridge's lights revealing the structure's fragility, every rotten plank, every corroded beam, every rusty nail. The premonition didn't speak of bridges, but the feeling that something was wrong, that this was a new trap, was overwhelming and irrefutable, a voice in her mind screaming danger. The sound of tires on gravel was muffled by the forest's density, which seemed to close in on her like a living trap, branches extending like hungry arms. The path to the right, almost wild and overgrown with vegetation, seemed like an entrance to the unknown, a path to the abyss, unadvisable in every sense, a suicide. The one to the left, a little more defined, but still precarious, seemed like the logical continuation of the scenic bypass, the route she had chosen for her escape, the most likely path to safety. "What's your move, Destiny?" she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, choked with fear and exhaustion, a mere thread of sound that barely broke the oppressive silence of the forest. The premonition had been about a curve, a truck, an explosion. There were no trucks here, only ancient trees, dancing shadows, and the disturbing silence of nature, which seemed to conspire against her. But the certainty that death lurked somewhere on that road, like a persistent, cold shadow, did not leave her, eroding her sanity with every painful beat of her heart. She returned to the car, the biting cold stinging her exposed skin, making her tremble uncontrollably, her teeth chattering frantically. Inside the SUV, the smell of her own fear, a metallic, pungent odor, was almost palpable, mingling with the scent of old upholstery and accumulated dust, a smell of abandonment. Her gaze fell upon the small printed map lying on the center console, a remnant of a more optimistic and carefree travel plan, a memory of a simpler, happier time. On it, the scenic bypass was just a thin, undefined line, a mere suggestion of a path without the complexity of reality. However, a small, almost imperceptible dot indicated an overlook somewhere along the route. But the map did not show the forks, offered no answers to her terrible doubt, gave no clue as to which path to take, which choice would be the correct one. Sofia decided to follow logic, what little remained of it amidst the chaos of her emotions and the rising panic. The road became even more winding, with sharp curves that demanded constant attention and nerves of steel, each one a challenge pushing her to the limit. Suddenly, the car's lights revealed an old, narrow bridge ahead, a wooden structure that seemed on the verge of collapsing at any moment. Should I cross? She thought, a knot forming in her stomach, twisting her intestines with dread. She hesitated, her body tense, every muscle contracted in anticipation of disaster, her eyes fixed on the bridge as if it could move, as if it had a life of its own. With a sigh of relief, almost a moan, she drove back to the crossroads. Back at the crossroads, Sofia felt even more exhausted and confused, a sense of complete disorientation consuming her, as if the world around her had lost all meaning and logic. The path to the right, previously dismissed as impassable and useless, now seemed to have gained a new sinister attraction, as if the forest itself were calling her to a final, inexorable embrace. The air was colder, biting, and a thin mist began to rise from the ground, crawling silently and enveloping the trees in a ghostly veil, transforming the landscape into a nightmare scene, a place where death waited in every shadow. The car seemed on the verge of stalling, the engine emitting strange, worrying noises, and the smell of something burning, perhaps oil or rubber, began to permeate the cabin, mixing with the damp forest air, a chemical and dangerous odor, a premonition. She checked the dashboard. Everything seemed normal. The indicator lights were off, but intuition was stronger than reason, an internal warning. But the feeling that something was wrong, that the car was about to fail, persisted. An icy intuition that warned her of imminent danger. Not just for the trail, but perhaps for her own life, for all her hopes and plans, for her future. She had avoided the explosion on Highway 200, the unstable bridge, the visible and obvious dangers. The engine coughed, choked with a guttural sound, and finally died completely. The machine's final, resigned sigh. Silence. A terrifying and absolute silence, more frightening than any noise, a premonition that the end was near. Sofia's flashlight illuminated the dashboard, which was completely dark, the warning lights dead, lifeless. The battery. Something was wrong with the battery, perhaps a fluid leak or a short circuit, something fatal and irreparable. But destiny, with its cruel and sadistic irony, had led her to a place with no exit, to a cul-de-sac, an inevitable end to her journey. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense, and the suspense escalated with every engine beat, every creak of the car, every moment of silence from outside that was broken by an odd sound. The car had no room to maneuver. She was trapped. Trapped in the middle of nowhere, on a trail that had led her to an impasse, a final point, a mortal embrace of the forest. The silence, previously oppressive, now seemed to carry a subtle hum, an echo in her ears, as if the entire forest were watching her, judging her choices, her despair, and her struggle. Sofia slammed on the brakes, but the car seemed to have a life of its own, sliding uncontrollably on the loose, damp earth, ignoring her commands, an out-of-control machine. Sofia swallowed hard, feeling her throat scratch, parched with fear. She had fled the explosion on Highway 200, the unstable bridge. But destiny, with surgical and perverse precision, had led her to a situation where her own car, her refuge, her means of escape, could become her tomb, her flaming prison. The tension was almost unbearable, a knot tightening in her chest, a racing heart that seemed ready to burst from her body. The premonition, which seemed to have been avoided, now took on even darker and more unexpected contours, showing that destiny, when mocked, was even crueler and knew how to wait, patient and relentless. She stopped the car abruptly, the engine sputtering before falling silent, the machine's last breath. With the flashlight in hand, she got out of the car. The air was thick and damp, and the silence was so profound that she could hear her own heart pounding, a terrifying and solitary sound in the midst of nothingness. The sign, though damaged, was still legible. Dead end. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was intense, and the air felt even thicker and damper, almost suffocating, heavy with humidity and fear. The view ahead opened slightly, revealing a dark, uneven clearing with what appeared to be an abandoned cabin in the distance. A dark silhouette against the forest gloom, a question mark on the horizon. The smell of damp earth and the humidity in the air were almost palpable, a sensation of oppression that increased with every passing second, slowly suffocating her. "There are no more options," she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse and low, feeling an overwhelming weight on her shoulders, as if the whole world were upon her, about to crush her. She couldn't and wouldn't go back to Highway 200. The image of the explosion was still seared into her mind with terrifying clarity, too vivid to be ignored. And the bridge. The bridge was a trap that she had, by pure luck, avoided, a tangible and real danger. All that remained was the wildest path, the one that seemed to lead nowhere, to an unknown void, an inevitable end, a surrender to fate. With a deep sigh of resignation, almost a silent lament, Sofia turned the wheel to the right, entering the almost impassable trail. The car swayed violently, throwing her from side to side, its wheels spinning on loose gravel and exposed tree roots that seemed like claws on the ground. Branches scraped against the car's body with a jarring, agonizing sound, like nails on a chalkboard. a sound that sent chills down her spine and made her skin crawl. She drove slowly, her eyes fixed on the narrow beam of light her headlights projected ahead, desperately trying to discern what lay ahead. Every shadow a potential danger, every curve a new challenge. The trail was so narrow that the trees seemed to close in on her, forming a dark, claustrophobic tunnel, and the feeling of being trapped was intense, suffocating, with no escape, like in a cage. With every meter she advanced, Sofia's apprehension grew, a ball of anxiety swelling in her stomach, twisting her insides. After what seemed like hours, a dark and suffocating eternity, the trail began to descend abruptly, the car sliding dangerously. It was then that she saw it. A rusty sign, almost completely swallowed by vegetation, lying on the ground like a forgotten epitaph. A cold shiver ran down Sofia's spine, a chill that didn't come from the air, but from within, from the recognition of her relentless fate. Dead end. She tried to turn back, but the terrain was steep and uneven, covered with rocks and roots, and the trees were too close, forming an impenetrable wall. The smell of burning grew stronger, more intense, and a subtle smoke, almost invisible in the darkness, began to rise from the car's hood, swirling in thin, menacing spirals. The air was thick, and the smell of fuel was now unmistakable, permeating every breath, clinging to her, a smell of death. The smoke billowing from Sofia's car hood grew thicker, ascending in dark spirals into the cold dawn, air forming an opaque cloud and the smell of burning. Fuel was now so intense it stung her nostrils, an acrid, dangerous, almost toxic odor that made her cough. The key turned uselessly, a hollow, hopeless sound. The engine didn't even cough, completely silent, dead. It was then that she noticed the small wooden cabin, almost swallowed by vegetation. A little further on, a dark smudge in the darkness, barely visible. Completely alone, with no one nearby, no hope of immediate help, just her own resilience. But at least she was out of the car, away from the imminent danger. She sat on a dusty chair, feeling the wood groan under her weight, trying to control her accelerated breathing, which sounded loud in her ears, almost a moan. The cold was intense, and she rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself. The smell of fuel seemed to have diminished, and she felt a little safer, a tiny spark of hope arising in her heart, a thread of light in the gloom of uncertainty. The sun, still weak, tinged the trees with shades of gold and orange, a promise of a new day, and the air felt fresher, cleaner, purified by the dawn. But the chill was internal, a cold in her soul that no clothing could warm, a deep sense of vulnerability. The hood was still smudged with smoke, but there was no visible smoke, no traces of imminent danger. Sofia approached, feeling a pang of hope, a glimmer of light. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could fix the car, or at least get a signal to call for help. She had fought, and she seemed to have won. The tables had turned in her favor, a victory against death itself, a triumph of life over destiny. Destiny seemed to have been outwitted, and a reflective message echoed in her mind. Life is unpredictable, and resilience is the key to surviving whatever the universe throws your way. But the echo of the road, which had guided her through so many dangers, still had one last, dark chord to play, a warning that the story was not yet over, and that the game with destiny was not won, merely paused. It looked old, abandoned, with loose planks that seemed about to fall at any moment. She hadn't eaten since breakfast in Seattle, which seemed to have happened a lifetime ago, in another world, a distant past. In her bag, she found a forgotten cereal bar, a small, unexpected treasure, a gift from chance. The food, simple as it was, brought a little comfort, a flicker of normalcy amidst the chaos and fear, a small victory in her struggle. And broken windows, like empty, dark eyes staring into the forest's gloom, a ghostly structure. Hours dragged on, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly, a black veil that never lifted, an endless darkness that enveloped her. The sound of the wind in the trees, a ghostly lament, the creaking of the cabin, every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, becoming a threat, a monster lurking in the shadows. Sofia dozed for a few minutes, her body aching and her mind constantly alert, her senses sharpened by fear, every noise startling her awake. The smell of mold and rotten wood was overwhelming, an odor of abandonment and decay that permeated the air, making it heavy, bringing with it the smell of dew and a new chance, a promise of a different day. Sofia felt exhausted but relieved. She had survived the night. She had outmaneuvered the premonition of Highway 200, escaped the bridge, and prevented her car from exploding during the night. Destiny seemed to have been fooled, or at least postponed, a temporarily dormant enemy, but not defeated, merely waiting. She pushed the creaking wooden door with effort, the sound echoing in the silence, and entered the dark, dusty interior where the flashlight's beam barely reached, revealing cobwebs and debris. The floorboards groaned under her feet, a sound that seemed like a lament from the structure itself, and the flashlight revealed a single room with a stone fireplace covered in soot and some old cobweb-covered furniture, ghosts of a past life, silhouettes of a forgotten existence. No one was there, only emptiness and dust. Completely dead, like a heart that had stopped beating, lifeless and pulseless. The interior lights refused to come on, and the radio was mute, just cold static, a reminder of her isolation. She was isolated, without communication, in the middle of a dead-end trail, with a car that seemed like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment, and she was trapped with it, a target. The silence of the clearing was broken only by the faint crackle of the cooling engine, a sinister metallic sound that resembled a ticking clock, and by the distant melancholic howl of a solitary coyote in the cold Montana night, a wild lament that echoed Sofia's loneliness, her desolation, and her despair. The air was heavy, laden with an imminent sense of disaster, as if nature itself was holding its breath, awaiting the inevitable, the moment of the end. The premonition didn't speak of mechanical failure, but the panic in her chest was real, almost as visceral as the fear she had felt in the vision of the explosion, a terror that froze her from within, paralyzing her. Sofia, with desperate urgency, tried to start the car once more, a last act of desperation, a futile attempt to delay the end she felt approaching. Her gaze swept the darkness of the clearing, searching for any sign of life or shelter, for an escape from the imminent death she felt approaching, a glimmer of hope. A sigh of relief, mixed with deep disappointment and despair, escaped her lips. She was alone. As she waited, a new sensation began to overwhelm her: hunger. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging like an hour, interminable, painful. When the first pale light of dawn began to seep into the cabin through cracks in the walls, she stood up, her body stiff from the cold, her muscles aching from the restless night. Upon leaving the cabin, the SUV looked harmless, parked in the clearing, an inert and silent object. The morning sun, finally clearing the clouds and night mists, bathed the clearing in a soft golden light, promising a new day and a fresh start. The smell of damp pine and fresh earth replaced the fuel odor, and the melancholic song of a solitary bird, a blackbird, broke the forest silence, a soundtrack to her apparent victory, to the end of her torment. Sofia felt an immense, almost euphoric relief, a weight lifting from her shoulders, a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent the night in the cabin, away from the car, but from within, from the recognition of her relentless fate, of her mistake. For her life's project, Sofia parked the car in the garage. The smell of gasoline in the air, intense, suffocating, filling her lungs with dense smoke. Only a strange sense of peace, of resignation, a silent understanding that there was nowhere left to run, that the struggle was over and destiny had found her. Destiny, with its intricate and relentless plot, had finally reached her in a way she could never have foreseen. and roads that, no matter how much one tries to deviate, always lead to the same destination. The premonition, avoided in every possible way, with so much effort and sacrifice, had manifested in a totally unexpected manner, in a place she considered safe, the end of her journey, the end of the line, the final point of her existence. The echo of the road finally fell silent, its last whisper lost in the inferno of flames. A sound, a sharp, dry crack, followed by a roar that echoed through the garage walls, amplifying into thunder, a deafening and terrifying sound. Later, news reports would speak of a strange fire in the garage, of a charred victim inside an SUV, an inexplicable death, a senseless tragedy for the world, a mystery without apparent solution. The fire, once a distant threat in the premonition, was now real. Not explicit, not violent, but an overwhelming presence, engulfing the darkness, consuming everything in its path, an implacable force. The garage shadows danced, growing, consuming everything in their path, and Sofia found herself surrounded by them, swallowed by hell. The sunlight, which had promised safety in the clearing, did not reach here, and the darkness became her own flame, her personal and insurmountable hell. An underground garage, dark and cold, with a smell of concrete and dampness, a desolate and lifeless place. As she exited the vehicle, she didn't notice the small fuel leak that had dripped during the journey, leaving an invisible trail on the ground, a silent and fatal track. As she reached out to flip the garage light switch on the wall, a spark, invisible and treacherous, erupted from the switch, a small blue flash in the gloom, a flash that sealed her fate and ignited the final flame. The leak had remained invisible in the darkness of the night, hidden beneath the car, a silent camouflaged threat, waiting for the right moment. The premonition, the smell of burning, the explosion. It was all there, waiting, like a patient predator awaiting its prey, a cycle closing. She had avoided the curve on Highway 200, the unstable bridge, the sputtering engine. But the final, most subtle and implacable trap was hidden in her own refuge, in her own car, her Trojan horse, the object that would lead her to the end without her knowing it. And the danger seemed to have dissipated, like a nightmare at dawn, leaving only a faint memory, a trace of terror. Destiny, or so she naively thought, had been outwitted, and she had cheated death. She approached the SUV cautiously, but with a growing sense of optimism and renewed energy. The hood was still smudged, but there was no visible smoke, no traces of flames, just the grime from the journey. A subtle, almost imperceptible glint on the asphalt beneath the car, like a dark tear on the ground, an oily stain that slowly spread. A small leak, a dark, oily fluid, dripping slowly, almost imperceptible at first glance, but unmistakably there. It didn't seem serious, just a few drops, a minor defect, an inconvenience that would be easily resolved. Sofia leaned in for a closer look, her face near the dashboard, her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to identify the liquid. It was a fuel leak, small but constant, a drop every second, persistent and silent. The air felt clean, fresh, purified by the morning, with the aroma of the forest and dampness. A sigh of relief escaped her lips, light and hopeful, filling the air. The battery was dead, perhaps. A problem that could be solved with someone's help, or a simple portable charger, something minor and controllable. She opened the driver's door, the sound of metal groaning in the morning air, a sound that, at that moment, seemed like a song of victory, a hymn to life, to her own survival. She sat in the seat, feeling the coldness of the upholstery, but the warmth of hope warmed her from within, a new fire, a flame of resilience. It was then that she noticed it. A cold shiver ran down Sofia's spine, a chill that didn't come from the morning cold. Tired but feeling a temporary, an ephemeral relief, and having reached what she thought was her final destination, The hotel in Missoula, where she was supposed to be now, a sudden, overwhelming heat that enveloped her in a fiery embrace. Sofia, in her last moments, felt no pain. Thick black smoke billowed up the elevator shaft, and the acrid smell of the fire began to permeate the upper floors of the hotel, alerting guests, causing panic and confusion. However, for those who understood the whispers of destiny, Sofia's story would be a grim reminder. There are echoes that never fall silent,